everybody, and welcome to Ivy Baptist Church, our Critical Conversations Bible Study Series. For those of you who I don't know, I'm Pastor Kevin Swan here at Ivy Baptist Church in Newport News, Virginia. We're so happy that you are with us this evening for our Bible study on tonight. And the topic that we're going to have is on human and sex trafficking. And so we're very excited to have this conversation. So let's have a word of prayer, and then I'll give some announcements and we'll jump right into our conversation. So God, we honor and we do thank you for this time and for your presence with us this evening. Bless our time together. Lord, let us learn, let us grow, let us understand, and let us act to be better and to address this issue. And we ask all of this in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So again, thank you for being on. These critical conversations are topics that I've been wanting to have within our church for quite some time, but never just felt the right opportunity to do it. And so I say, well, let me just take a Bible study series and just have the conversations that we need to have, that hopefully from these conversations will spark interest and action to address the issues that we are discussing over the course of the last 3 weeks. And so I want you to do some things for those of you who are watching. The first thing that I'd like for you to do is to like this particular broadcast, whether you're watching it on Facebook or YouTube. Please take a moment to like it. Liking it will help us as we move forward in this. We also want you to share it. So please take some time right now to share it on your social media outlets. Let your family and friends know. They really need to hear this conversation tonight and be involved in it. The third thing we need you to do is to subscribe to our channel, especially on YouTube. Our goal right now is we're right around 9,500 YouTube subscribers for our church page. And what we really are trying to do is to get to that 10,000 mark very, very soon. So if you've been coming to our YouTube channel and haven't subscribed, please take a moment to do that. That is very important to us for you to do. And then the final thing is we want you to comment. So tonight, if it's going to be a conversation, then you need to be able to comment, and we want you to comment so that we can ask questions, we can hear from you, and I can share those questions and comments to our guests that are with us on tonight. So again, the topic is human and sex trafficking. And so where do we begin with this when it comes to scripture and believers, and what should our approach be? Well, on the very first page of the Bible, in Genesis chapter 1, we find these words in verse 26. It says, "Then God said, let us make mankind in our image and in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. So what we see on the very first page of the Bible is that God gave mankind, both men and women, the ability to rule over what God has created. However, there's one exception in those verses of which God commanded that mankind cannot rule over, and that's each other. Nowhere in scripture is it that mankind is to rule over or dominate another human being. And that's where abuse comes in, and the conversation that we're going to have tonight. And so that's the purpose of why we're having this, because even though we're believers, we live in a world that is filled with people who are unfortunately taking advantage of other people. And so how can we as a church act? Well, first of all, we need to be more educated on the issue. So tonight I am pleased to welcome to us tonight, first of all, Miss Christy Wells. She is the CEO and co-founder of the Safe House Project, which is a nonprofit organization that combats trafficking in America, which was founded in 2017. So, Ms. Wells, thank you so much for being on tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And then also we have with us Detective Renee Guillory. She is a detective with the Newport News Police Department, where she has been in this role since 2018. Detective Guillory, thank you so much for being on tonight as well.
Of course, and thank you guys for having me.
Yes, so in the chat, please right now say welcome to them. Let's be hospitable, everybody, and say welcome, Ms. Wells and Detective Guillory, to our critical conversations. I need y'all to drop that in the chat so they can see that you are actually being loving and kind to them as we have this conversation. All right. So let's go ahead and get started, shall we? So I'll start with you, Ms. Wells. Can you tell us, of yourself? Give us a brief introduction about you and how you actually became involved in this arena of anti-human and sex trafficking.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I can tell you that for me personally, this was a seed that God planted in me years ago. I was 16 years old in Costa Rica on a missions trip, standing on a hill on the foundation of a building that was intended to be built, a place that I know now to be called a safe house. And I was overlooking a valley, and that valley was full of tents, and those tents were full of children as young as age 6 that were being sold into the commercial sex trade in Costa Rica. I couldn't wrap my head around it. It was families that were oftentimes selling their kids into this trade, believing that they were giving them a better life. So the program where my feet were standing was one that was going to be a safe home that provided education and life skills training and therapy, not just for the kiddos that they were pulling out of these tents, but for the family members that were selling them to help educate and rehabilitate the family and the family structure to provide greater stability for the survivor as they moved forward. But I came home with a heart on fire. I'd seen something I couldn't unsee. But life took me in different directions, as it would for any 16-year-old. And it was years later that God brought that back into view for me. Then, as a military spouse and a mom of 3, my husband had gone around the world to fight the foreign enemy. I believed that trafficking was something that existed only internationally. And then a friend of mine went to South Africa, saw a need to build up a safe house for girls that were at risk of trafficking. Nigel, y'all met him earlier today. And he came back, and I jumped in for that project. But as we began doing that, people started to say, that's great, but what are you going to do here? And I didn't understand. I didn't believe that was something that an evil that could exist here, but took a deeper dive to understand the real problems, the real needs, and the real opportunities to make a difference here. And jumped in with both feet when God said go, and launched the organization with Nigel, as well as my other co-founder, Brittany Dunn.
Yeah, we're excited to hear about what the Safe House Project is all about in this conversation tonight. And thank you for accepting the call. And yes, it's hard to believe at 16 years old, you're watching in Costa Rica. And many people don't think that these things can happen here, because people may look at it, well, that's in South America. That doesn't happen here in the States, that parents can actually sell their children into sex work. But we're here to say tonight, it does happen here. And it is happening here, and we just need to have that conversation. So, Detective Guillory, out again for you. Kind of tell us your story as well about how you became involved in this work of anti-human and sex trafficking.
I became a police officer. I think most of us become police officers because we want to help people. I made it a point to get to where I am now and a detective in the Special Victims Unit. Because for me, I like working with the victims is very meaningful for me. Sometimes, especially with children, Christy mentioned that a lot of children suffer abuse at the hands of their family. And so sometimes I'm the only voice. And it starts somewhere, sometimes with the school or something like that. But I like being that voice and helping people transition into a safer environment and processing the things that have happened to them. And if that looks like getting justice, sometimes it does, because people want to go that route. Sometimes it doesn't. And it's just putting them in touch with people and organizations that can help them. So that's kind of why. And I've also got into, I'm a task force officer with the Hampton Roads Human Trafficking Task Force with Homeland Security. So also, which allows me to investigate cases not only in Newport News, but in other places, because obviously trafficking involves multiple jurisdictions. So that allows me to be able to do more and help more and have more resources to help other people.
Yeah, so thank you both for your commitment to this work, because I know it is desperately needed. And so, Detective Guillory, I will stay with you. I'm not going to assume that everybody knows or has the correct definition of what trafficking is. So can you educate us tonight? How do you define, and Christy, I'll ask you as well, but how do you define what trafficking actually is?
Okay. So I can give you the legal definitions of human trafficking. Trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, or obtaining of a person for the purposes of commercial sex acts or labor services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. And that through the use of force, fraud, or coercion is really important from a legal aspect. The most common forms of trafficking, human trafficking that we see are labor and sex trafficking. Where labor trafficking is like forced labor or involuntary servitude or debt bondage, which you see a lot of times at motels and smaller labor operations, maybe landscaping operations or farms or factories or something like that. And then obviously we're here talking about sex trafficking, where you see that with, child sex trafficking or just prostitution or escort services and even massage parlors. And I just wanted to touch on, because we talked about labor trafficking, and there's human smuggling, which centers more on transportation, and it's the importation of people into the United States illegally with a deliberate evasion of immigration laws. And a lot of times, because those people, even though they come here voluntarily and usually pay someone to bring them, because now they're in a foreign country with, no support, don't speak the language, no family support, no financial support, and things like that, that can usually sometimes lead to trafficking, whether it be labor or sex trafficking.
Wow. Yeah, that's why we need to unpack this. So Christy, for you, is that similar to how you define trafficking, and how do you distinguish between human trafficking and sex trafficking?
Absolutely. I think her definitions are spot on, and those are the ones that we are guided by as well. I think the only thing I would add to that is that if a child is being used for commercial sex through either prostitution or pornography, that is still considered trafficking, because a child is inherently vulnerable, and therefore in courts, they do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion, which are the metrics used to determine a vulnerability for an adult. And so I think that's a really important thing to distinguish, because there are still states that will prosecute a minor for prostitution. But I can tell you that behind those kiddos is somebody who is controlling them. That is not something no child wakes up one day and decides they want to be a sex worker. So I think that's the only definition or differentiator or addition I would make to that. In terms of how we differentiate between the two, really human trafficking we see as kind of that higher level umbrella, because underneath it is where you have labor trafficking, it's where you have sex trafficking, it's where you have organ trafficking, it's a number of different forms of trafficking. I think there's 20 different forms of trafficking that are under that umbrella. Renee, correct me if I'm wrong. It's a high number.
Yeah.
So a variety of different types, but the two most common, as she said, are labor and sex.
And so in these cases, children or adults are forced into these areas to do something that's against their will for the purposes of coercion or fraud, or something else that you had mentioned earlier, right? So
for the purpose through force, through coercion or fraud, but for the purposes of monetary gain for an individual.
Okay, for monetary.
So it's the commercial elements that is the differentiator.
Got you. So given like technology, for example, we know that technology has evolved and continues to evolve at a rapid pace. Christy, do you think that trafficking, we know at the core of it, trafficking is what it is, but how has it evolved over the years and what you've seen since the founding of the Safe House Project in terms of how people are trafficked, how they get into trafficking? How has that evolved over time?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the main thing, a few different points. One is all of us were raised with the idea of stranger danger, right? Watch out for the creepy man in the white van down the street. That was something that was pretty standard for all of us growing up as kids. But what is happening now is that predators are coming into our home without ever walking through our front door because they're coming in through digital technology. But the differentiator here is that they have ways of representing themselves as friends to peers, because a 42-year-old man can easily disguise himself as a 13-year-old girl and build a friendship. So kids don't even know that the predators are the people that they are, because of the cloak of digital technology. Now, how it's evolved, I would say even in the last few years, during COVID, we saw 97% of online recruitment during trafficking because kids went online, parents went to work online. There was very little safety around internet technology. Parents, honestly, sometimes we just don't know what we don't know. And so, we know to tell our kids what to do when they walk out the door, but a lot of parents haven't slowed down to understand the dangers and the things happening on internet and game rooms and chat rooms and online gaming systems to know even how to put the guardrails in place for their kids. And that we're doing our kids a disservice. There's one of the games, Fortnite, that the average age and gender on that game is a 42-year-old male.
Wow.
And those are predators that are looking for children, but most parents don't know that.
Yeah, Fortnite is an extremely popular game. And if people
It is.
haven't seen Fortnite, they need to check it out. Parents, you need to check out Fortnite because it is very popular. And what you're saying is that most people on Fortnite aren't kids. They're adult predators looking to engage with kids on Fortnite. Is that what you're saying?
It is.
Sheesh.
That was the data I saw. Now, I'll preface that. That was the data I saw in 2019, moving into 2020. It could have shifted, but that was a very predominant demographic that was online at that point.
Yeah. Detective Guillory, how about you? You've been in the work since 2018. How have you seen human and sex trafficking evolve over the years?
I mean, she absolutely hit the nail on the head there. Like she said, we as kids we're taught not to talk to strangers. And I mentioned, I think earlier when we were talking, that I teach my son, I try to tell him, the same thing applies on the internet. Don't talk to strangers on the internet because you don't know who you're talking to. The difference is in person, you can see them. Online, you really have no idea who you're talking to. There's all these apps and, social media, Facebook, the TikTok and the dating apps. You're supposed to be 18 to have an account, but anybody can make an account. It's not like they check it. Anybody can pull a picture off the internet and say that they're this person. And so, you think your 12-year-old teenage daughter is talking to another 12-year-old teenage girl, and they're not. You have your gaming systems, your PS5, and I go with that because that's what my son has, connects to the internet, and he can stream and talk to anybody. So it's about parents being aware, be aware of what your kids are doing. Who are they talking to? What apps do they have on their phones? I recently learned through one of my cases that there's a calculator app that you can hide, that kids can, not just kids, but anybody can hide pictures in. There's a app on, your iPhone, and the pictures, there's like a secret picture folder, so if those aren't things that you know about as a parent, then you don't know to look out for them on your kids' devices and see what they're doing, who they're talking to, and things like that. Chrissy talked about COVID. I think one of the other things that came along with COVID, obviously a lot of people, lost their jobs, had problems, their income changed, things like that. So we saw a lot of issues of people having problems paying bills, becoming homeless, and maybe losing their place to stay. So then what you see is an increase of what we call something like sextortion, which is essentially, it's a form of exploitation where maybe the offender will employ something like non-physical forms of coercion for sexual favors. So you have people performing sexual favors in order to have, in place of paying their rent this month, we'll go with that, or reduced rent or something like that. And And then it turns into blackmail. If you don't do this for my friend, or if you don't keep doing this, I'm going to let your family know, or, someone that you care about know what was going on. The same thing happens to kids online. Again, you don't know who they're talking to. They think they're talking to someone the same age, or, a teenage boy thinks they're talking to a teenage girl. They're not. And they, convince the kid to send them pictures, and then they turn around and blackmail them and tell them they're going to send it to, somebody they care about and things like that. So the internet has definitely made it easier for predators to reach out to kids and even adults. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and for the purposes of this conversation, I know we're talking a lot about kids right now, but Christy, can you elaborate on the fact that human trafficking and sex trafficking is not just a kid issue, right? There are many adults also that are involved and are victims of this type of trafficking. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I think the oldest victim that we've helped this year was 56 years old. But it is worth noting. So absolutely, we have those over the age of 18 that have been exploited. But I think what's also important to recognize is that for many of them, that trafficking began at the age of 12, or that early childhood sexual abuse began early. Those boundaries were broken down, and they didn't know what safe relationships looked like. They didn't, or maybe they had gotten into a position of vulnerability. A friend of mine was a school teacher, had come from a domestic violence marriage, had 2 kids, and one of the dads actually ended up trafficking her, and he was a long-range truck driver. And so he would take her on the weekends and make her put her kids with her parents. So anybody can be trafficked. Traffickers don't discriminate. They will take any age, race, socioeconomic status, or gender. And when we recognize that that can happen, that those as young as infants and those as old as 56, 65 can be trafficked, and it can be anybody, then it broadens our aperture to recognize the vulnerabilities in our communities and those who have the ability to be impacted.
Yeah. And that's it, right? And that's why we're having this conversation, because many people think of trafficking as for kids who were victims. Maybe they went out playing and then somebody grabbed, like you said, the white van, right? But that's not the case anymore, and anybody can be a victim. So, Christy, again, maybe people are listening, and again, you started off in Costa Rica with this, right? And then you came back here to the United States to create the Safe House. Maybe people don't really understand how big of an issue is trafficking in our country, and even narrowing it down, how big of an issue is trafficking in the Hampton Roads area?
Absolutely. Well, I'll speak to the US. What we saw from the Department of Justice in 2017, I believe, was when that report was issued, was that they estimated 300,000 American kids were being trafficked in the United States every single year. That was the data that they pulled. Now, I will back that up to say they have since rescinded that report because it's an illegal industry. It's like trying to say how many drug trafficking instances are happening every day. We have no idea. But the fact is, 300,000, with as prevalent as school shootings are in our world today, based upon those numbers, our children are 7 times more likely to experience trafficking than they are a school shooting. And so, as vigilant as we are as parents to protect our kids, to make sure they know about the signs and the concerns about those who might be experiencing depression or suicidality, or might be a danger to others, we're missing the opportunity to be vigilant about what's happening in our communities and those who are vulnerable. Now, when it comes to Hampton Roads, I can tell you, in the 5 years that we have been operating, I personally have served at least 12 survivors out of the Hampton Roads community, and we know that victim identification across the nation is only at 1%. So I guarantee you, I'm only seeing a small fraction of what is happening there, but I'll let the detective speak to what she's seeing in Hampton Roads.
Yeah, and while she's away, can you just take a moment to speak about the work that you actually do with the Safe House Project, so that people can understand just how impactful it is to address anti-human and sex trafficking?
Of course. So, as I'd said, when we began, there were 300,000 estimated American kids trafficked in the US. Victim identification was only at 1%. But then we realized that without a safe place to go once they escaped, 80% would actually end up back in traffickers' hands. So, we launched the Safe House Project to do few key things. First is to increase victim identification through education. There was a lack of victim identification because people didn't understand what trafficking really looked like. It was being mislabeled, misidentified, dismissed, labeled as sex work, and so we were missing opportunities. So we trained and equipped people through a variety of different training solutions, including, I don't know if the ticker's at the bottom, but there's one that you can go visit yourself and take the free 1 hour training at iamonwatch.org. And that is an incredible training that we developed with survivors to help people understand what trafficking really looks like in America and provide actionable intelligence for you to be able to help somebody in need. So as we're increasing victim identification, we trained over 270,000 people over the last 6 years. But as we've been doing that, we've been increasing identification and we've been helping survivors escape. And so when we do that, we help them get placed into safe homes. So we really work to bridge the gap to help them get to safety, receive the restorative care that they need. So we're placing survivors, even from Hampton Roads, all across the United States because we want to make sure they get into a quality restorative care program that can meet their individualized needs. So to date, just this year, we've helped 362 survivors escape. But right now we're helping between 50 to 80 survivors a month. From there, we also help increase the number of safe homes. Like I said, when we began, there were only 100 beds in safe homes across America, but we've worked to systematically add 371 new beds across the United States. So the survivors that we serve might call us from Hampton Roads, but we really work to place them in safe homes across America.
This is amazing, the work that you're doing, and we certainly commend you. If I'm hearing you correctly, 300,000 children estimated every year are trafficked in one way or the other.
Yes.
And you're working to get 300, I think you said 371 beds or places across the country that you've been able to create?
It is. And then we will add another, 100 plus this year.
And even though in all of the work, and even in all of the work that you're doing, it still seems like it's a drop in the bucket compared to the number of estimated people that are actually involved in trafficking, right?
Absolutely. I mean, we work as hard as we can, as fast as we can to serve as many survivors. But the fact is, the only way that this is going to be eradicated is when we have an all hands on deck approach, because this isn't going to be solved by one organization or one law enforcement agency or one individual, but it's really when everybody comes together and communities unite that we can start seeing the problem and solving the problem.
Yeah. Detective Guillory, same question to you. How big is this issue? Like, I mean, I know Christy just gave us the stats, but in your area, what are you seeing as far as human and sex trafficking in our area?
We see a lot of we do see a lot of juveniles. Most of our cases are juveniles just because that seems to be the most vulnerable population in this area. We also have a large immigrant population here, which we talked about earlier. They can be vulnerable to sex trafficking or labor trafficking. Believe it or not, we actually have quite a few labor trafficking cases around here. And it's just because this is a pretty touristy area. You got Virginia Beach and Williamsburg and things like that. So it's really easy for people to be extorted in the tourism industry through hotels, any kind of I talked about a laundry facility earlier, things like that. And then again, with the vulnerability of juveniles and just juveniles being easily accessible online, we have a lot of, runaways and maybe other kids or people in bad situations at home where they might meet someone online, or they just might run away and randomly meet someone. We've had that happen, where this person will say that they will give them a safe place to stay, and food and things like that. But in exchange for those things, this kid or adult has to go and do essentially sexual favors for other people. There's usually some physical abuse involved in that, as far as intimidation and things like that. But sometimes in the victim's mind, that's safer from where they came from, or they know that if they don't do these things, they're going to get put out on the street. And in their mind, that's, even more unsafe, because in the situation they're in now, they have somebody protecting and looking out for them. Whereas if they're on the street, they're on their own. So, and then you have, some kind of other large events. Like, I think a couple of months ago, we had Harbor Fest out in Virginia Beach. So we have large events like that tends to bring in a lot of tourists. And so you kind of see a rise in maybe victims during that time. And we also have a large military population here. I didn't even think about that earlier, but that also can lead to some trafficking and things like that. When boats come in to, the naval base there in Norfolk, you just have a large influx of people. So anytime you have a large influx of people, whether it be for tourism or, say an aircraft carrier coming in, the traffickers put it out there because they want to make the sex available. And so you kind of see a rise in those things during that time.
Yeah, I'm so glad we're having this conversation, because I hope our viewers are really getting educated on what this is, because this is a huge issue. And what I'm hearing, Christy, is it's going on right around us, right? It's all of it's going on, and we might not even be paying attention to it. We might not even be realizing actually what's happening. I do want to ask you a more specific question about how big of an issue this is. Now, to be fair, our church is predominantly African American. In your work at the Safe House, are you seeing minority? Are you seeing African American? Are you seeing people across the board? What kind of is the composition of ethnicity of the people that you see?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So while, as I mentioned, this will touch any age, race, socioeconomic status, or gender, we do see this disproportionately impacting the Black and Brown communities. That is, we've heard a variety of different reasons that, law enforcement doesn't respond as quickly, which we know is a problem. We've seen some of it come through almost a normalization of some of the pimping and hoeing culture that's happening in communities, in some of the urban communities. I've seen it in Norfolk when I've worked in some of those areas. And so that's really where we've seen it. But the fact is that it's across the board, but disproportionately impacting Black and Brown communities for sure.
And Detective Guillory, for you as well, in the cases that you've done, have you seen it disproportionately minority, or is it pretty consistent across the board?
No, I would agree with Chrissy. It's absolutely disproportionate in minority communities. I'm sorry, there was something that you mentioned and then it just totally went out my brain. That made me want to say something. Oh, talking about minority communities. I know earlier in the day, we had talked about maybe some of the reasons for that, the cultural issues. That's what it was. The normalization of some of the cultural things. He said, like the pimping and hoeing stuff. And I would agree with that. I think another thing, which is something significant that we talked about earlier in the day, it's important to mention that, when it comes to kids, or a lot of the offenders against the kids, or that have a hand in it, is a family member. And when I talk to kids in any kind of sexual abuse case, and we ask the kids, especially when people don't disclose the abuse until they become an adult, then a lot of the reason for why they don't tell is, one, because they don't believe they're afraid someone's not going to believe them. But two, they don't want to disrupt their family unit. Because if they do, then it feels like it's their fault. And, maybe if the offender is the breadwinner in the family, then now they're losing their money. They're losing, maybe the family leader will say, and things like that. So there's a lot of reasons for people not telling and not wanting to come forward. And that, makes other communities more vulnerable than others. I talked about some of the immigrant communities earlier, and when people come here from another country, a lot of times they come here without family, or even if they do come with family, they still, you've lost you're moving from a whole different country. I don't know if either one of you guys have ever actually lived in another country. It can be very stressful. I was military and lived in another country, and I had a support system. And even then you can be away from family. You can't, you don't speak the language. It's just, then you feel a little isolated. So I think that makes those, immigrants more vulnerable as well. But I would agree that it's definitely disproportionate in Black and brown communities.
So I want to be clear, because you all are very eloquent in how you are sharing this. My congregation knows that I'm not as eloquent, so I just tell it like it is. So the culture of our African-American community, the music that we sometimes listen to, is promoting misogyny and certain types of other behaviors that are not appropriate. And now you can tangibly see one of the reasons why we need to steer our kids away from that. Because now what you're seeing is there is a disproportionately higher rates in our community of human trafficking. And nobody's talking about that. But we're going to go out here, we're going to play all the music that talks about shooting and killing and demeaning women and calling us out of our name. But then nobody wants to say anything in our families, because we know that a lot of this is stemming from our families, because we have code in our community about no snitching. And so no snitching didn't start in the streets. No snitching started in our families, where we decided we don't want to tell anything and anybody our business, because we don't want to be ashamed or embarrassed about our information getting out into the community. So a lot of this is starting there. And so if we really want to address this issue, and I'm hearing from them that this issue is disproportionately higher in our community, then that means we need to take some ownership for what's really happening. And what's really happening is starting in our families. The stuff that we don't want to talk about, the stuff that we know that's going on, that uncle, that cousin, you know who I'm talking about. And we want to keep all that quiet. And so when we keep it quiet, this stuff perpetuates. And now it is leading to the stuff that we're seeing. I need y'all to make some comments. I see some people are making comments. Thank you, Trent, and others. But I need y'all to start making some comments on how you feel about this conversation and some questions. We want to make this where you can chime in as well, ask questions to our guest tonight, because this is a very fascinating conversation. Now, Christy, I want to come back to you, because I do want to distinguish again between if it's consenting people involved in a situation, is that still considered trafficking if it's consensual but between two people, or is it the forced piece? Like, for example, if even if it's an adult, for example, there's two adults and the person is being like Detective Guillory said, in exchange for me staying here, I will perform sexual acts. That's not considered trafficking, is it? Or do you consider that trafficking?
Honestly, I think definitely I err on the side of it's trafficking more than the legal system will allow for. But when I see we will do this in exchange for services, that person has a vulnerability that somebody is exploiting. And that is, very few people. I've served some folks in a homeless community in Phoenix during the Super Bowl. And while they weren't the ones that we were there to serve, that were trafficking specific, trafficking was rampant through that homeless community, because there were women who said, I had to have sex to get a haircut. I had to have sex to get my tent back. I had to, it was just, and so that's survival sex, which is still arguably a form of trafficking in most jurisdictions, depending on what the code is. The other piece to it that I often reiterate, because trust me, we have men who are like, well, listen, I mean, if it's the happy hooker, then, I'm just paying the bills. Promise you, no man ever looks at her and says, honey, you okay? is there anybody who has your kids who's making sure that you fill a quota tonight in order to make sure that your kids aren't hurt? How you doing? How old are you? These aren't conversations that are happening. And so the dismissal that there's a willingly engaged party, I can tell you that from our experiences, those who have been considered the happy hooker, the prostitute, or the escort, 98% of those that I have served had somebody behind them pulling the strings. They weren't in control of their ID. They weren't in control of their money. They weren't in control of their livelihood. They weren't in control of where they went, who they slept with, what decisions they made. And so that, when you start putting that whole wrapper around it, then you go, that's trafficking. So, like I said, I err on the side of trafficking more than I do a willing participant, just because of what I've seen in the survivors we've served.
Yeah. What about in our community? I just be honest, there's sugar daddies, and sugar mamas. I don't know if you know what that is.
Oh, yeah.
That's,
sure.
That's an older person that is with a younger person, and they're paying bills, and the younger person can't afford it. And so the older person is paying all of the bills in exchange for favors, whether sexual or not. But it appears to be consensual in nature. Do you consider that to be a part of trafficking as well?
I think that it walks a very thin line, and it might not always cross that. It might be that there is somebody who says, you know what, I don't want to work, want somebody to pay my bills. I'm willing to do this. Oftentimes, again, my perspective is that there's going to be some vulnerability behind that. And I think that the sugar daddy could also easily convert it into a commercialization where he is now saying, now for me to continue to do this, now it's beyond me just getting a favor from you. Now I'm going to make money off of you. And that, once you cross that line, now you're into full-blown trafficking. But it's a very thin line, and which is why a lot of the camming that's happening online, a lot of these, so I don't know if y'all are familiar with that, but it's, there are a number of websites where a young girl can get on there and can provide content, whatever that sexual content may be, and can have subscribers. But then there are people who will say, I will pay you to do X. And so that's how they're making money. There are girls that are paying their way through college camming because all of a sudden they think it's a safer thing than stripping or, escorts or whatever that may be. But that is a very fine line to somebody moving into being trafficked, because all it takes is somebody who comes behind and says, honey, you're making a little bit of money, but I can help you make a lot of money. And you just need to put me in control and put me in control of your finances. And so it's just the same thing. It might be okay, might be legal, but there is a very fine line that they're going to cross into experiencing trafficking.
Yeah, camming is very popular. OnlyFans, for example, is wildly popular, and people are taking advantage of that. And you're right. People are saying, hey, this is a way for me to make money. And it is legal. But you're right. It has the very potential of moving into an area that is not safe and unhealthy.
Right. So, and those websites, just to add, those websites also aren't doing age verification of those who are producing content. And so, again, if it is a child on there, then that line becomes even thinner into the trafficking realm.
Yeah, which actually is why, and I talked to our congregation about all this stuff. We know pornography is wildly popular. And Pornhub, which is one of the more popular sites, got taken down because, well, not completely taken down, but largely taken down in part because of the underage content, and they couldn't verify the ages of people who were uploading videos and all that stuff. So you're absolutely right. Detective Guillory, Christy, where I struggle in this conversation, because this is centered around Bible study. So we're this is a church setting. We have a pretty good sized congregation. And if I'm hearing you tell me that trafficking is higher in the African American community than other ethnic groups, then that tells me there are probably some people who come through our doors, maybe every Sunday, that I don't even realize that could be engaged or involved in trafficking. So my question now is, what should we be looking for? Like, what are some of the signs that maybe we should be paying closer attention to see if somebody is actually in an unsafe and trafficked situation? Christy, I'll start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think at some level you can't ever know until you sit down with them. I always say nobody cares how much you know till they know how much you care. And so we have to step in as the church to be the hands and feet of Jesus, to hear somebody's story and to know where they're hurting. I remember when we launched this organization, there was a gal who sat down in our home group, and she'd been there a few weeks and had been quiet and been kind of awkward at times, but we just kept loving on her and just kept welcoming her in. And then one night she opened up and she said, my dad sold me for sex from the time I was 2. My mom knew. I was not the loved daughter. My sister never experienced any of that. And at that time, I didn't even understand trafficking fully in the United States and didn't know how except to be there and to love her. But again, those come from that place of relationship. Now, we did do a training called God's Heart to Eradicate Trafficking that you may have seen, or I think Brittany could have sent you, but we'll make sure you all have it. But it really is about how the church as a body can come around and identify trafficking outside of just taking the on-watch training and wrap around somebody, because there might be people who walk in the doors that look like they have severe mental health, that you don't understand that it's a trauma-based response, and they're don't even understand fully that what they've experienced is trafficking. There's those that might walk in and they look completely inappropriate in how they're dressed, and they're going to be flaunting their fancy purses, and they're going to be talking about their boyfriend, and they're going to be talking about all of their dates. Dates is just a different word for those that they continually have to meet up with for sex. But there are those that could be completely overt. But then one of the very first cases we ever had was a Black little girl. She was 13 when we got her out. She had been sold for 3 years by her grandmother to pay the family bills and to pay for the grandmother's drugs. They had trafficked the mom. The grandmother had sold the mom for sex historically. And when the mom became too drug addicted and STD ridden to be abused, they turned to this little girl at 10 years old to be the family's source of income. And so those are just, it could be severe mental health. It could be, those who look like they're a high-end escort. It could be those who, again, are little kids that look like they're just in a vulnerable situation. And you don't know fully if there's trafficking or there's not. But my point is, we never fully know until we step in, and we step in with them.
What a terrible story. Horrible. I'm brokenhearted to hear. And I'm sure you see those stories all the time. A mother selling her daughter first. And then when the daughter could no longer do it, she then trafficked her granddaughter for drugs, is what you just said.
Yeah.
Detective Guillory, for you also. Again, I'm under no delusion. I'm sure that there have been some people who have come through our doors that have been trafficked. What should we be looking for? Are there any signs? Is there anything that we can do to pay closer attention?
Yeah, I mean, like Christy was talking about, I think you don't really know until you reach out, but you might, notice just some little things that are not very obvious. You might notice someone coming in, someone dropping them off and picking them up, and this person doesn't socialize with anybody because they're not allowed to socialize with anybody. They don't have, maybe they're allowed to come worship, but that's the only type of social situation they're allowed to have. You might see kids who they might be dressed normal. We'll say in school, for example, like a 12 or 13-year-old kid who sleeps all day during class. And, that might be written off as this kid stays up and plays games all night, or they're lazy. But what you don't know is the reason why this kid is sleeping all day is because they've had to go home and literally work all night. And maybe get like an hour or 2 of sleep until they're allowed to go back to school. And school might be the only socialization that kid has. That might be the only time that kid eats. And you know, if you start noticing, especially kids being like undernourished or malnourished and things like that, that might be, you know, a reason to start asking some questions or notify somebody. Adults oftentimes they'll have, like she was talking about, their, you know, their IDs, driver's license and things like that. Somebody will be holding that. Somebody will be threatening their children. So it's just, if you see something that you know, think if you see something, basically say something. It might not seem like a big deal to you, but you never know what it can turn into. Because a lot of times, you know, we'll get tips from a teacher or a family member or a healthcare worker that it doesn't seem like a big deal at the time, but once we start looking into it, it turns into something. And had that person, that teacher, that family member, that healthcare worker not said something, then there's no way that we'd be able to help this person. Might see signs of, you know, physical abuse. Obviously, that's kind of something that would maybe stand out, but it's more like the little not obvious things, like the not socializing, noticing that someone's very controlling over this person and things like that.
Yeah, and I go back, and yeah, we hear that all the time. If you see something, say something. And yet, sadly, that is counter to the culture of our community, because the culture in our community is you better not snitch. And so this is, again, for those of you who are watching, why there's continual pain and stuff that is perpetuated in our community in silence, because nobody wants to say anything. We want you to drop your questions now in the chat. We're coming toward the end. This has been a fantastic discussion, and I want to make sure that you can get your questions answered. Detective Guillory, I'll start with you. There is one question from Cass. Thank you, Cass, for sharing it. She said, what laws are on the books for those found to be sex traffickers or in sex traffic rings, for example? And what are the rates of prosecution for these types of cases?
I mean, so the definitions that I read earlier, that's essentially the federal code for trafficking. There's a lot more things that usually go hand in hand with that. Obviously, you have the trafficking stuff. What we didn't really touch on was that usually involves lots of different forms of sexual abuse. Sometimes it can be quite difficult to process the trafficking cases at a federal level because of the many jurisdictions involved, because of the technology used by the traffickers. Sometimes they have better technology than us, unfortunately. Sometimes that's just what it is. I can tell you that I think what I pulled was in 2022, there were, at the federal level, there were only 178 sex trafficking cases that were prosecuted federally. That's not to say that, obviously, when you look at that, it doesn't make trafficking, it seems like that trafficking's not that big of a deal, because they think, well, why are there only 178? Well, a lot of it has to do with being underreported. And a lot of it also, I think, has to do with it's prosecuted at a different level. Different crimes are prosecuted other than trafficking. So we might go with a sex abuse or maybe some kind of sexual exploitation or the child sexual abuse material or something like that. Because there might be some reason that we can't prove actual trafficking. Or sometimes, unfortunately, the victims don't really want to cooperate because they're afraid. So that's something that organization, that we try to help victims, because we don't force victims to participate in that. I'd rather get them help and make them feel safe than force them to participate in a prosecution. That's not something that we do, So.
Okay. Thank you for that. And Christy, to you on that same question, I know you're trying to get people safe, but do you actually get involved with any legal aspects of people that you're working with?
So I'll be honest, I have a deep love for law enforcement because we've seen so many great law enforcement agents step into this when it's been hard. But But I've also seen some rotten apples, and I've seen trafficking victims afraid to come forward because of one of them, 33% of her buyers were law enforcement.
Mhm.
And so it's, I'm sure you've seen that. And so when it comes to prosecution, they have no faith in the system. They have been slapped with charges when law enforcement's done these big prostitution stings. The buyers get off with a slap on their wrist, and the girls get their picture posted in the paper as being arrested as prostitutes. Like, we have an upside down system in terms of the way that prosecution is handled. And so right now, all we're doing is perpetuating a narrative that this is a low risk, high reward industry.
So in that, we're encouraging people to speak up, but even the ones who are involved don't have any faith that speaking up is going to be of benefit to them because they don't think
No. Yeah. And because traffickers will also force them into petty crime.
Yeah.
And so they'll have, you know, you could probably rattle off the charges, Renee, faster than I could, but petty theft or whatever on drug charges.
That's
They'll
the
make them
most
be drug
common,
mules.
I think, drug charges.
Yeah, so they'll make them go into some of these crimes knowing that it's going to slap them with a charge or some kind of a warrant because they'll move them to a different state. And then they're terrified if law enforcement picks them up. And the traffickers perpetuate a narrative that if you leave, I am the only one that will take you back. I'm the only one that cares anything about you. You're nothing to anybody. You're dirt, you're scum, but I'll take you back. And they believe it, you know, and because that's all they've ever been told is that they're a commodity. And so it's really hard to break those cycles of violence and those cycles of victimization, and to believe somebody that they have dignity and value, help somebody believe that they have dignity and value and worth as a human being and not as a commodity. That the mental chains are the ones that are the hardest to break them free of.
Keep those questions coming in, everybody. This is a great conversation. We don't have much time left. We want to try to get as many questions answered for you as we can. Another question for you, Miss Christie. It's, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe this is Ashera. Please forgive me if I mispronounced your name. She said, correct me if I'm wrong, but is there a universal hand sign that can be used for people who need help?
I'm going to give you my opinion. I'll let Renee give you hers. You know, there are things that get spread out on social media, and if there's zip ties on your car, that's a sign that a trafficker's coming after you. And if this is happening in Target, then somebody's coming after you. And if this is the hand sign, I can tell you we've never served a survivor who's been rescued by that, because here's the piece. That requires them trusting that somebody's going to see them and respond, that law enforcement's going to do the work that they need to do. Unless it is somebody who's in that 4% of victims who are abducted, I would wager to bet that there is no trafficking victim that has done that, because, again, they don't believe they're a victim, or they don't believe anybody will help, or to ever have the courage to do that sign and think that there's going to be a response on the other side.
Okay. Detective Guillory, you want to comment on that? Anything on hand signs?
I think Christy did a pretty good job. I mean, that's, one, would be something really difficult to get out, but two, like she was talking about with the zip ties and the things that get put out on social media. Honestly, the reality is traffickers don't need to do that, because it's so much easier to pick up people from the internet or locate more vulnerable people. I mean, we talk about stuff being online. People don't realize how much just posting a picture online to, you know, your social media account gives so much information. If my kid posts a picture of him in his, you know, in his basketball uniform, I've just told everyone where he goes to school, probably what his last name is if it's on the back of his uniform, that he plays basketball. You can go online to almost any school and get, you know, basketball schedule. So that's not even, there's just, I guess, easier ways that traffickers can get to their victims. I mean, again, I think it goes back to letting people know that you're there to support them. And if you see something, if you think something's going on, then say something. I mean, I think that's what it comes down to.
Okay. Another question, Sister Helga Stokes. She's asking if you have any data on what city or town, maybe this is locally or even nationally, do you know of that has the most or highest rates of sex trafficking? Are you able to make that determination? Do you have any data on that?
Helps if I unmute myself. It's a little bit of a double-edged sword, because you're going to see higher propensity of trafficking happening in high-density populations. So yes, you're going to see it in the LA County and the New Yorks and the Dallas and the Miami and those kind of things. But the fact is, it's happening all around us. So part of that is also trafficking reports is what we're going off of, which means they're seeing the problem and law enforcement is more effectively trained. But I can tell you that per capita, it's happening, and per 100,000 people happening in these rural communities, sometimes just as much. So we do have a report that's on our website that actually breaks down trafficking by state per 100,000 based upon identification rates. And so it helps you kind of gauge that a little bit more. So California is higher, but it is also, again, a denser population. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Renee, but I will tell you, I have also seen things happen in Hampton Roads communities where trafficking is happening in one city. And because of the little love fest that we have going on with that 7-city area, law enforcement's super kind to make sure that they drop that off into another jurisdiction. And they will call and say, you have a human trafficking case, because they don't want it reported in their community. So we've also seen that happen far more times than I'd like to admit.
No, I think that is part of an issue. And I think with some of the smaller jurisdictions, it might come down to they don't have the resources available to them to be able to investigate that. And they don't really know, I guess, how. I don't. I'm thankful that here we have, a large number of HSI task force officers, the Homeland Security task force officers. Plus, we have an office right there in Norfolk. So I feel like we have a number of resources here available to us as law enforcement to help with those cases and to get make those prosecutions successful.
Yeah. So Robert asked, and Christy, I'll start with you. If you think someone in your family is trafficking someone else, not a victim, but is actually doing it, what should you do?
Honestly, I would say the best thing is, number one, you don't approach the trafficker, because you're messing with their source of income, and that's not going to go well. You need to contact law enforcement and tell them, I believe that this is happening, and here are the signs that we see present that make us believe that this is happening. These girls aren't in control of their money. There's men coming through the house every 30 minutes. If you tell them that there's minors involved, then law enforcement will respond. You can also ask for called Department of Children and Family Services, or the Virginia equivalent of that, to report something. The other simple thing is that you can actually provide them our contact information. And again, I'll make sure you have that, because we will help survivors escape. And so sometimes, instead of it being a full-blown thing, it's just giving them a card that says, hey, if you're in a situation that's not safe, this is somebody that can help you, and we can help facilitate exits. And sometimes we do that in partnership with law enforcement. Sometimes we send an Uber and the girl gets in it, and we can help get her to a safe home.
Yeah. Detective Guillory, let me ask you a question. I know you had talked about the stings earlier. I'd like to go back to that, because we do hear about stings quite often. And for those of you who don't know about a sting, that's where perhaps an officer will portray themselves as a minor or something like that. And then, they're interacting with people online, and then they set up or arrange a meeting. And when the people come to wherever the arranged meeting is, they're arrested. Are those considered trafficking cases, or is that considered something else? Because we see all walks of life of people that end up being arrested, including pastors. Let me be clear,
And police officers.
and police officers. So, are those things considered trafficking or something else?
I mean, it just depends on what's going on, but it absolutely can be. I mean, that's kind of that's a short answer, but it just depends on what the nature of those conversations were, and what brought this person here to, to this meeting place. It can be trafficking. It can just be something dealing with some child sexual abuse material, and maybe something, solicitation of a minor. But it really just all depends on what those conversations consisted of, honestly.
Okay. So Ms. Linda asked earlier, Christy, about, listen, she's heard enough. She wants to get involved in what you're doing, wants to be more educated, maybe even wants to connect with a safe house to serve. How can people, after hearing tonight, say, man, I had no idea that all of this was going on. I want to be a part of this solution. I know there's been some websites that we have been putting down on the ticker. Bill, can you put that back up, please? I want people to see that again. Can you first speak to the websites and the toll-free number, and then what else can be done for people who are interested in wanting to help?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we do have a large team and different folks that work for us in Hampton Roads. My co-founder is in Hampton Roads. And so we are always looking for people to be trained, to be speakers, to advocate in their communities, to get training into the schools. There's a variety of different things that you can do. So we would love help. The very first thing for us is to go on to iamonwatch.org and take our free training. It will print off a certificate once you're done. And then if you email that to Kelly, Kelly, at safehouseproject.org and say, I took the training, I heard Christy speak, and I want to be a volunteer, then she can help get you started in that process. And the hotline that's on there, by the way, is the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And that is where they also aggregate tips. And I should have said that for the earlier conversation. We always refer to local law enforcement where we can, because that just expedites things. But that is a national hotline where you can call, report human trafficking tips. They aggregate them and push them down to law enforcement. So that can be effective as well.
So iamonwatch.org, free training. If you complete the free training, then you can contact the email address again is Kelly at safehouseproject.org. If you email her and tell her you completed the training, then you will be eligible to serve as a volunteer within their organization. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, she'll work. We've got a variety of different volunteer opportunities. So she'll just work to figure out which one is the best fit for you. But that's gets you into that step one, and then that individualized placement happens from there.
So what would be an example of a volunteer opportunity where people would serve? Can you give us a couple of examples?
Yeah. So because of the way that we work with the survivors calling in and then us placing them, that is an internal role. However, ways that, so it's not a volunteer capacity. So a lot of people say, well, I want to serve with the survivors. There are other local organizations that we can point you to if you do want to love on and serve survivors, even if you're going to a home and cooking a meal or doing something like that. But for us, we have events that we could use volunteers at. We have people who are trainers that they could get trained to be speakers. We have ways that there's community, you can help drive community engagement events. We create what's called Hope Bags for survivors, where it's ones that we provide them once they're exiting their trafficking situation. So we'll usually have 60 made in a location, and then we get them to our Safe House partners across the US. So it's really that first gift that they receive once they're getting into a safe home, or once they're exiting their trafficking situation, that gives them those basic necessities just to feel known, seen, and loved.
Now, there's another website that you shared in the ticker. I think it was Thorn. THORN.org.
Yep.
Can you
So
speak to that as well?
absolutely. So just when we were talking about sextortion earlier, I think that's one of the most prevalent forms of trafficking, I would say, on the rise right now. And when it comes to all of our kids, that is something that is so important for us to be aware of. And so this really just speaks to the prevalence of it. And then they've got some great parent resources on there that talk about the conversations and the prevention that we can do on our side to help protect our kids.
Okay, so yes, that's a great segue into how I want to end our time together. I really want you both to speak to parents. There are parents that are watching, there are grandparents that are watching. How and what should parents and grandparents be doing to keep kids safer from predators that are everywhere? What are some basic tips? I know you talked about earlier about the phones and stuff, but could you go back to that and talk a little bit more in detail about what should parents and grandparents be doing in watching and trying to protect their kids? And Detective Guillory, I'll start with you on this one.
Okay. Yeah, we did talk about phones and social media and all that stuff earlier. Honestly, I think that you need to have the hard conversations with your kids. And that website, I'm glad that Christy put that up there. That Thorn is a really awesome website to help parents find a segue into those hard conversations about, what's appropriate and not appropriate on the internet. And essentially, like, I tell my kid, don't talk to strangers on the internet. And I'll be honest, I have a teenage son. He knows that I will go through his phone. So that's just one of the things that I do. I also to have conversations, with him and even with other teenagers that I talk to about safe adults that they can talk to if something's happening or they feel unsafe. And I always think it's important that parents should know that their kids need to know, or the parents or guardians need to be okay with the fact that it may not be them that child wants to talk to for whatever reason. Maybe they're afraid that they're not going to be believed. Maybe the kid is just ashamed. So I think it's really important for a guardian or, a grown-up, parents, grandparents, to have the conversations with kids about safe adults they can talk to, and to let the kids know that it's okay for them to talk to another safe adult. Now, and then, their parent or guardian will help them through whatever we need to later on. But the important thing is getting the kids to say something and educating our kids so they know what's okay and what's not okay. And then educating ourselves so we're aware of all the things that our kids are using. Because I'll be honest, my kid is way more tech savvy than me. So I've had to make it a point to know about the apps and the calculator app that you can hide pictures and all these things. So I think it comes down to being very open and honest with the kids about what's going on, and designating safe adults, and just being aware of what your kids are doing and who they're talking to and interacting with.
Yeah, parents, you got to be parents. Yep, you got to be parents. Christy, any advice that you would give for parents and grandparents to help in this situation for kids to be safer and combat the human trafficking and sex trafficking?
Yeah. So, I mean, I completely agree with Renee. We have to be present. We have to be willing to have the hard conversations, because if we're not, somebody else is. And somebody else is willing to be the one to educate our kids the way the world sees it. And we have to be able to protect them. If they're really young, there's another book, it's another link I'll put up, but it talks about good pictures and bad pictures. It's the world wants to swing our boys and our girls, but largely our boys, to if there's a pendulum, one side is protector and the other side is predator. The world wants to swing them to that predator side earlier and earlier by early exposure of pornography. And if they don't know what's out there, I've seen stuff that is softcore porn caricature ads on my kids' apps that they have no idea that that's dominatrix or whatever it is, but it's found its way in as an advertisement. And so apps don't censor it. And so if they don't know how to see and how to reconcile what they're seeing, the world will normalize um, the subjugation of women super early. And so having those conversations, talking about pornography, talking about good pictures or bad pictures, talking about um, the difference between secrets and surprises. Because there's a large, movement of, oh, well, we can keep this a secret. Even educators will keep secrets from the parents about their own kids, and so it's helping them understand early on what are secrets and what are surprises, and talking about healthy and unhealthy relationships. So I put a couple of links. One is to Love 146. Another one is to Thorne's Parent Guide. So those are just great tools that have done far more in depth than what we could go into right now on preventative measures. But the other one is Bark. And we have vetted out a lot of technology around keeping kids safe on the internet. I actually met Brian, the founder of Bark, years ago. He had taken Twitter to market. He took Gmail to market. He took a number of different things to market. And then he had kids and said, oh, shoot, how do I keep them safe online? And there was no solution. And so he brought all of his tech solutions together to create a really robust platform that can monitor kids' apps. And they alert you if they download a new app. They can alert you if kids are chatting. It can see into a lot of the different things that we as parents don't even know to spot check if we were to pick up our kids' phones. It can not just monitor for language and nudity and those kind of things, but also suicidality and harmful behaviors and bullying and all of those different things. So really, really cool app to put on your kids' phones, on their tablets. There's systems now that you can do it to integrate through your whole house. So if there's one tool I would recommend, it would be Bark.
Very good. So we are out of time. This has been an amazing conversation. I want to thank you both. Like I did earlier, before we leave, I need everybody that's viewing right now, I need everybody to take a moment, go to the chat in all caps with about 12 exclamation points behind it. I need y'all to type thank you, because I need Christy and Detective Guillory to see how appreciative we are for this conversation. And they have given us some wonderful insight and educated us on some things that is happening all around us. And sometimes we might not even pay attention to. So right now, because I'm going to give them one final opportunity to share what they want to share, but they need to see. There we go. I see them coming in now. Now I see about 5 exclamation. I need about 7 more behind. I need about 12. Okay. I need to make sure that they know how appreciative that we are. So Christy, I'll start with you again. Thank you so much for being on tonight. Any final remark, anything you want us to leave with that you think is going to be important?
I think it's just knowing that through education, through awareness, you all can truly make a difference. Educate yourselves on how to see it. Educate yourselves on how to respond, which is the God's Heart to Eradicate Trafficking training that we did for the churches. But more than anything, just being willing to step into conversations with your kids, to step in and love on somebody who needs you. We've got to take time to slow down in such a busy world, to be present. And when we are, we can see the things that have been hiding in plain sight.
Thank you, Christy. We really appreciate it. And it's my hope that even after tonight, that Ivy will find ways to connect and partner with you and your organization.
We'd love that.
Yeah, we're going to figure out a way to do that. Detective Guillory, again, thank you, because you were on earlier today as well. This is you're doing double duty with us, and I certainly appreciate you taking time out of your schedule today twice to talk about this. Any final remarks you would like to make?
I mean, I appreciate you guys having me. Like Christy said, I think it comes down to like education and awareness, and letting people know that you're there for them and you support them. I think the support and it is a big component of, victims coming forward and getting help. I can attest to the Bark app. I actually use that for my son, and it is actually pretty awesome when it comes to being able to monitor what's going on. But so I appreciate you guys having me.
Absolutely. And I want to leave with this. What they said tonight was the trafficking issue is disproportionately higher in African American communities. We have to deal with this, y'all. This is why we're having this conversation. And we can come to church and we can shout and do all that kind of stuff, or we can really be salt and light in this dark world. We have a choice that we have to make. And I'm praying that we will choose to be the hands and feet of Christ in the world where it needs hope and love and support and safety for everyone. So I thank you all for watching tonight. Let's take this information and let's move it from conversation to action. And so again, Ms. Christie, Detective Guillory, thank you so much. We appreciate you. God bless you all. Thank you all for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
Yeah.
Detective.
Yep.